good to see so many of you here. We're actually back as an entire assembly. So it's the first time in a couple of weekends. We've been in our different streams, all focusing on either the work and transport, work and travel, homes and community, diet and lifestyle. So we've all been hearing from lots of different evidence leads, different pieces of evidence, lots of different information. But this afternoon, we're all coming back together, and we're coming back to do a bit of focus on a couple of things. One, we're going to be looking at a bit of assembly business. So some of the things that as an assembly are some process things that you as an assembly will need to decide about how you want to make decisions moving forward as we start getting to the point of really tying down what our recommendations are going to be and how we're going to be presenting this to Parliament. So that's what we're going to be doing for some of the afternoon. And now the part of the afternoon, we're going to be looking, there were a lot of questions that came up around, but how could these things be funded? What sort of budgets are there? How could these things actually be delivered? So we're going to be spending a bit of time hearing about some of the options around that and how things might be able to be taken forward. So just a couple of quick reminders, especially while we're in the main room today, because there's so many of us, if everyone can keep themselves muted while we're in the main room. When you're in your breakout rooms, obviously you'll be able to talk. And the second thing to remember is when we're looking at the presentations and things like this, you can change how they show up on your screen. If you go up to the top of your screen, normally the top right-hand side of your screen, you'll see different options for how you're viewing things, whether it's a gallery view or a standard view. So, particularly when we're looking at the videos and things, then often we find that standard view will work really well for people. So hopefully you'll all be able to see and enjoy what's going on. I know we've got a couple of people still coming in from the breakout rooms, but I think we're probably ready to get moving, and I will hand over to Ian to introduce the first thing we're going to be looking at today.
Thanks for that, Kayla. Hi, everyone. So just the first thing I thought we should introduce you to is how the Children's Parliament's been getting on. So if you remember, in parallel with our process, there's 100-odd kids scattered across Scotland that's been looking at the same themes as what we've been looking at. And I get the chance a few weeks ago to drop in on them and to see how they were going. And obviously lockdown has disrupted what they've been doing, but they've been doing great stuff, really getting into it, completely engaged. They've got a video for you and you'll see they've not short of ideas. Some of them completely bonkers, I have to say. And some of them actually not that much bonkers at all, and really impressive. I think the kind of key thing though that struck me that I hadn't thought about until I went in was the fact that there's the ideas that they're coming up with. That's fair enough. But the point is that, the age that they're at, we're talking about in the next few years, and certainly in the next decade, we have to make the most radical transformation in order to achieve many of these climate targets. And then when you look at the kids, in 10 years' time, if they choose to be, they'll probably be students of university. So they're not going to be in positions of power and kind of choice. In other words, they will inherit the world that we are shaping now. So what we are putting in place now for these next few years and the next decade is the world that they will move into. They don't have the choices. So they are reliant on the wisdom of our decision-making, really. And I think that's the way that I would look at the contributions from the Children's Parliament. It's that perspective, that oversight that they're given is really what is going to be the kind of key question. That should be the thing that dictates our guidance, our impact. But have a look at the video. I have to apologize. There's some really bad dad dancing in there from me. I apologize for that up front. But anyway, let's have a look at the, if we can run the video, you'll see what I mean.
So there was the film. Hopefully you all enjoyed that. We're going to pop you into your breakout rooms now. You're going to be in with the new group and potentially a new facilitator. And there'll be people from, that have been looking at some of the different topics to you. And we're going to give you about 20 minutes now just to sort of catch up with each other, hear a bit about what each other has been doing in different topics, and also any thoughts or reflections you have after watching the video from the children. So hopefully our breakout rooms are ready to go, and we'll go from there.
Brilliant. Welcome back, everybody. Thank you for taking the time to reflect there. So we're going to be moving on to some assembly business right now. So I'm just going to share my screen and talk you through what we're going to be doing. So in this session, the plan is to hear a presentation from myself and to consider some different options for how we frame the recommendations and voting process for the assembly. So basically here, you're going to have an opportunity to think about how we are going to frame the recommendations and the voting. You're going to have a chance to reflect in your breakout groups after I've run through this presentation. So please do bear with me as I do that, and please do pay attention to the different options that are before us. But your facilitators also have a copy of some of the slides, so you can come back to them in your breakout rooms too. There's something that we're going to need you to do overnight, although the vote will run until the lunch break tomorrow. And that is to vote on your preferred options. But I'm going to run through what it is that we need to vote on and what those options are just now. So one final thing to say, I think, is that when we come to looking at the text of the recommendations in the next step of the process, we'll take an opportunity then just to pause and remind ourselves of what a strong, clear goal and recommendation looks like. But for now, we're just really focusing on the framing of the recommendations as a whole and the voting process. As always, it's good to remind us of the assembly questions, but there's two really important things to bear in mind as we go through this. The first, of course, is to bear in mind the question, which again is how should Scotland change to tackle the climate emergency in an effective and fair way? And remember, for the fair part, you will need to consider the list of fairness propositions that you created as you're reviewing the recommendations. So that's something that will sit alongside you as you're going through that review process and the further developments and refinements too. So do remember the fairness aspect and the fairness propositions, and that's something that will keep alongside us as we're reviewing the recommendations during the rest of the process. I'm going to come on to talk about the second thing that's really important to bear in mind, which is effectiveness, in a moment. But before I do, I just want to share a quick reminder of how we've got to this point. So you may remember that last weekend and the weekend before, within our different work streams and within our different groups, we worked on questions 1 and 2 and questions 3 and 4 for each of the streams. And when we did that initially, we had a Jamboard, and on that Jamboard, there was a template that had some questions. So you populated that with lots of responses to those questions. And that's what's on the left-hand side here. So some of the questions you were asked were, what is the proposed recommendation? What is the proposed recommendation trying to achieve? And if you remember, you came to that after having a brief discussions about some of the challenges and some of the issues that there are. You also talked about the type of action that you'd like to suggest in order to basically achieve what it was that you wanted to achieve and to tackle the challenge or issue it was that you'd identified. And you also had a conversation around who needs to take the actions that you've suggested. So that Jamboard is what forms the basis of the discussions that have come next. So when you were talking about what this proposed recommendation is trying to achieve, that has been translated into the goals and the ambitions that you would have discussed in the session this morning and last weekend around questions 1 and 2. The types of actions you were suggesting have formed the basis of the recommendations that you've been discussing. And who needs to take the action has formed the basis of the levels of change that you've been reflecting on. Which brings me now to effectiveness, and the second thing that we really need to bear in mind as I go through this. So effective can be understood in 2 different ways. First of all, it could be understood in addressing climate change, as that's a key point in the overarching question for the Assembly. But secondly, when we're talking about effectiveness, especially in the context of this presentation, we're also thinking about how we produce a well-constructed set of recommendations that make a lot of sense, that are clearly developed, and that can be actioned, bearing in mind where this report will go to the Scottish Parliament. So a set of recommendations may be less effective here, for example, if there was such a huge amount of recommendations, it was really, really difficult to comprehend what some of the instructions were within them, and perhaps what should be a priority and where attention needed to be focused. So decision makers, for example, may struggle if there's loads and loads of recommendations and to comprehend and to make sense of that. On the other hand, a smaller set, and you can define small however you want to define it, we're not setting parameters here, but a smaller set of clear and well-developed priority recommendations could and may be more effective, as they may really hit the mark of what is most important to you as an assembly, with a really clear steer on the actions that need to be taken. So over the course of this weekend and next, we're going to go through a process of consolidating your recommendations, so that those which are the same or similar are merged, and they're refined to ensure that what it is that you want to say is really conveyed through them. And of course, it's up to you how you want to do that and the way in which you choose to do that. So we're also going to ensure, alongside that all of the supporting text and information is really clear and crisp too. But there's just a few things to consider around effectiveness. So you need to sit there and think about whether or not you want to highlight the priorities that you think are the most urgent and important. And the decisions that we'll be touching on today will have an effect on that. You also may want to consider that long lists can lead to something called cherry picking. So that's where you have a long list of stuff and people pay way more attention to one thing than they do another thing. And you also want to consider a clear and focused set of recommendations with supporting evidence and narrative will be really helpful to decision makers and policy makers to understand what needs to be done and why. So do just bear that in mind as I'm talking through the rest of this now. Okay, so this brings me to one of the decisions you have to make, which is around the framework. So basically, when we talk about framework, we need to decide how we're going to present the recommendations, because how they are presented does have an impact on effectiveness and what comes next. So each framework comes with some pros and cons, which you'll be able to weigh up and talk about and discuss in your groups. But it also gives, I guess, the design team as well a bit of a steer about how to kind of create some of the templates and the things for upcoming weekends. So we really do need to focus for a moment on framework, because it will form the basis of what we end up with and how the results are presented in the final report. Although you will have a bit more of a chance to discuss that presentation in the final report in the final weekend. There's another point to consider here too, connected to effectiveness. So it's quite difficult to tackle climate change by working just in silos or focusing on just one theme that we have discussed over another. So being effective means that we need to consider some of that cross-silo action. So that means that it's quite important to think about how all of the recommendations may complement or contradict each other. And we are going to spend some time, especially when we come back together as an assembly next weekend, thinking about that and figuring it out. But that does mean that we do need to decide a framework now. And the way that we've worked so far makes all of the options you're about to hear possible. So remember, whatever you decide, you just want to ensure that you have a set of recommendations that demonstrate what you really truly believe as an assembly are the ambition and actions that need to happen for Scotland to tackle the climate emergency in an effective and fair way. So on that basis, there are 3 different options for this framework as we see it and how they're presented. Option number 1 is the presentation of workstream recommendations and overarching goals. So in a moment, I'm going to show a slide which basically sets these out in a bit of a more visual way for those that might just be struggling with the text and the verbal explanation. But what number 1 means is essentially, we've been working in 3 different work streams: in diet and lifestyle, in home and communities, and in work and travel. And that's partly because we're tackling such a huge topic. So it really makes sense for members to have had the opportunity to dive deeper, to dig deeper, and to consider the different but connected issues that we have. So this weekend, we are going to consolidate within each of those 3 work streams so that when we come back together as a full assembly next weekend, each stream returns with a clear and refined set of goals and areas of actions to share. But we could easily come back with 30 goals and a much larger set of recommendations. You may have heard earlier today that We currently, across the streams, have 42 goals and over 130 recommendations. And you'll see in reviewing the recommendations that there is a huge amount of overlap between within each of the work streams between the different questions. But also we can notice that some are emerging between the different work streams as well. So having work streams organized by separate themes, you might want to think about, are there overarching goals that you kind of need to consider to connect different things, as well as having stuff laid out in that way. So just to give you a quick reminder of what the work streams are, and the questions we've discussed within them. Of course, we have diet and lifestyle, and there's 4 questions connected to that. There's home and communities, and there's 4 questions connected to that. And there's travel and work, and there's 4 questions connected to that too. But the overarching bit is essentially anything that doesn't quite fit within them that you think may be a connecting recommendation or goal that needs to be made. So there's an opportunity to do that, and we'll come to that next weekend. So the second option is a set of overarching goals with some connected recommendations, which will see all of the recommendations and goals from across the work streams come together and be presented as just one big final list of goals and recommendations. And again, just another reminder that when we come back together next weekend, you are going to have the opportunity to hear and to review what's come out of all of the different work streams and to deal with some of those overlaps, and also have a chance to spot any gaps, and you'll still have that opportunity to add in any overarching goals that you still think are missing after that. So in this scenario, just to summarize, that the recommendations will be reviewed and considered as a whole, rather than reviewed and presented just by the topics or the themes that we've discussed. And through setting some overarching goals, it's a task that you've already started. You can then better connect different recommendations from across the work streams and look across the board to recommend how Scotland can change to tackle the climate emergency in an effective and fair way. And the third option is presenting recommendations alongside levels of change. So if you remember the rainbow, it's basically voting across that and presenting them on that basis. So I'm just going to show you a slide, of course, with the rainbow. So if you remember, this is what the rainbow was that we worked with when we were dealing with levels of change. So what that means ultimately for presentation, for those of you that might want to see this in a slightly different way to kind of help your understanding, is this. So again, this might look a bit overwhelming and daunting when you just see it pop up on a screen, but you have a chance to digest it in your groups. So option 1 there, remember, so this is the option on the first left-hand side here. And just to say, the way that it would be presented in a report and laid out, you can imagine it works vertically. So in option 1, remember, you would have an opportunity to have some overarching goals, but you would organise on the basis of the 3 work streams. So you'd have your diet and lifestyle perhaps coming under the overarching goals, and under diet and lifestyle, which would be the header, you'd have a set of goals and recommendations. Then you'd have another header, which was homes and communities, and under that, you'd have a set of goals and recommendations. And then you'd have travel and work, and under that, you'd have a set of goals and recommendations. And then in option number 2, instead of having those headers, you would just have your goals and your connecting recommendations. And within that, you would include the overarching things, the things where there's been big gaps, which you have the opportunity to identify next weekend. And then in option 3, you would then organise in a very different way, and your headers would be the levels of change. So you'd have a header that was for society, norms, values and beliefs, and a set of recommendations connected to that. You'd have a header that was public policy, regulation, taxes, incentives, and a set of recommendations connected to that. You'd have a header that was organisations, businesses, public services, and a set of recommendations connected to that. You'd have a header that was homes, communities and neighbourhoods, and a set of recommendations connected to that. And then you'd have individual and a set of recommendations connected to that. Okay, I'm going to pause just for a sec, just for people to digest that before I move on to the next one. But just a reminder, your facilitators have a copy of these slides, so you can have a quick look at them when you come in your groups and share any thoughts, general thoughts and reflections about how we organise this too. Okay, so what I'm going to move on to now is voting thresholds. So this basically means that we need to agree on the number of members voting in favour of a recommendation for it to be supported by the Assembly and therefore become an official recommendation of the Assembly. And there are three options here. The first option is a single threshold, and that's 75%, and that's the same that we use to agree weekend number 7. And it represents basically agreement from 3/4 of Assembly members. The second threshold is a single threshold too, and that's of 80%. And the reason you may be thinking, there's not much difference between 75 and 80%, but 80% represents a marker of a higher level of consent. So that shows that the recommendations that become a formal recommendation of the Assembly or goal were supported by 80% of members, and that's just a slightly higher level of consent across the Assembly. Some people have referred to this in other processes as perhaps a supermajority or near a complete consensus. And then the third option is different. It's on levels of support. So essentially what this means is anything that receives under 50% of support across the Assembly does not become a supported recommendation or goal from the Assembly, so it's therefore not supported. Anything which is 50 to 75%, that becomes a minority supported goal or recommendation. And anything over 75% becomes a majority supported recommendation. So it just shows the strength of support. However, I will caveat that by saying that no matter what threshold or level you choose, and we will revisit this conversation in weekend 7 when we think about how things are presented in the report, you can still see how many members have supported what recommendation, no matter what option you choose here. And I'm now going to move on to the ballots. So when you log on to do your votes, this is essentially what you'll be selecting when you choose whether or not you support a different recommendation. And I have a slide after this just to show what that looks like visually in a second too. So on the ballot, option number 1 might be quite a classic option. It's whether or not you support, do not support, or want to abstain. And the threshold that we choose, which you saw on those previous slides, those 3 options there, will determine whether or not something is supported or not supported, or if there is an abstention. The second option is that instead of just having support, do not support, abstain, we actually have a bit of a scale. So you can imagine that you would have a scale that asks you to think about whether or not a goal or recommendation to tackle the climate emergency in an effective or a fair way. You'd be asked to strongly agree, disagree, or strongly agree. So you select those options, and then there's a calculation which produces an average score, and scores are combined to say whether or not that then becomes something that's been supported across the Assembly. And then the third option, and there's another decision that will need to be taken, but it doesn't need to be taken now, it can be taken later, which is around the number of recommendations you'd want to include here. But the third option, which is as follows, it's which X number of recommendations are most likely to achieve effective and fair change in order for Scotland to tackle the climate emergency. And so what you would need to do as an Assembly at a later point is just decide kind of the maximum number you would want within that. And then when you come to do your vote, you would select the number of recommendations or goals that you think should then become part of the formal recommendations of the Assembly. So visually, which may help some of you, it would look like this. So in option 1, I'm just at the top here where you select whether you support, do not support, or abstain. The ballot would look like that. So you notice you just have 3 options to choose from, and you'd have to click one of them. In option number 2, which was that scale where we'd get a weighted average score, you'd have a bar and you'd have some stars that ran from strongly disagree to agree to strongly agree. And you would select which star you wanted to agree with, and then there'd be a weighted average score. And then in the third option, you would be presented with a framing question, which is, which goals, recommendations do you think are most likely to achieve effective and fair change in order for Scotland to tackle the climate emergency? And then below that, there'd be a list of goals or recommendations, and you'd need to select a number from them, depending on the number that is decided. Okay, I'll just pause for a second, just for you to digest that. But again, your facilitators do have the slides. And to finish, I'll just move on to some practicalities. So practically, the voting will take place via SurveyMonkey, which is what we've been using to date. You will all be voting individually. So this is your choice, it's your decision. You'll be voting on your own individually. Although that said, there will be support for members that may need some support filling out the survey from a technical perspective, and the support team will be available for that, perhaps via phone. Key votes will be taking place outside of the main daytime sessions. Primarily, this is to give you enough time to sit, to consider the different options, to make sure that you don't, feel rushed into making a decision. So there will be some kind of time parameters that are set, but you will be able to leave the session to think about things, to sit back and reflect, and then to log your votes when we come to that. And then, of course, in weekend 7, as I've mentioned a few times, we will be further discussing how to actually do the presentation of stuff in the final report, as well as adding any extra and additional text that we need to at that point. But by that point, the decision will be made in weekend 6 and in the vote that follows about the recommendations and the goals that you do want to make a formal part of the report for the Assembly. Okay, I appreciate that was a lot of me talking at you, and that was quite the run through. And some of you may be feeling confused. That's absolutely okay. That is why we have built in time after this to go to your groups, do a bit of sense checking among yourselves, and hopefully get to grips with what it is that we're asking you to do. One final thing to say, and just do remember this as you're having your chat, is that by the time you vote, you will have gone through a long process of composing, of consolidating and refining by the whole group through the course of the rest of the course of the Assembly. All of the work that you've done so far and all of the work that you're about to do is building up to producing a set of recommendations. So it's really, really important that you all take part in shaping that. Please do all take part. So by the time we come to vote, there should be a relatively strong and clear set of recommendations that really reflects what it is that you want to say. Okay, and on a practical note, of course, the voting is something that you do need to do this weekend, but Juliet is going to send you by email at the end of today an email that has a link to this survey. And if you need any support, Juliet, who I know has been waving, and the support team will be around tomorrow morning if you want to hop on a call and you need any support to fill in your votes for this.
We'll remind you of all of that when we finish up today as well. So, and the other thing, while you're in your breakout rooms, if you do have any questions, Kelly or me or Tim are available to come in and sort of clarify anything as well. So we'll send you off. Hopefully that conversation was useful to help clarify what you'll be considering and what you'll be voting on later. We are now moving on to an evidence presentation, and we'll have the opportunity to do a question and answer with the speaker later as well. So I'm going to hand over to Ian now, just to explain what's going on and introduce our speaker.
Thanks, Killa. Thanks. So, yeah, thanks, everyone. And we know that out of these groups, out of these discussions, have been lots of talk about the costs and the kind of procedures by which we get to some of these big deliverables. So the next presentation really is aiming to try to connect with some of those big questions, really. And we're going to be delighted to hear from Chris Stark, who is Chief Executive of the Climate Change Committee. Now, this is a committee that came out of the 2008 UK Climate Act, was set up to be the kind of statutory advisor, really, to the UK government and also to the devolved governments about climate change, and particularly for the UK, about how we're going to get to net zero. And it's also worthwhile pointing out that the CCC, as we refer to it, also in December, late December, as we were in the middle of some of our deliberations, produced what was called the 6th Carbon Budget. And that really is a roadmap of how the UK can get to net zero. So what we've got is we've got a video from Chris, who's going to introduce himself and talk about some of these issues. And then after the video, there's going to be the opportunity to ask Chris some questions really from the floor. So if we can pass over to the video, that would be fantastic. Thank you.
I'm not sure if any of the research team might want to just speak for a moment before we finish up.
I could.
Thank you, Nadine. Yeah, we've just heard that she wasn't able to make it. So, yeah, if you could just sort of speak.
So one of the things that we were going to use this, 5 minutes or so for was for someone from the Citizens Assembly of Scotland to talk about their participation in the research. And then if any of you had any questions about the research at all, then this was an opportunity for you to ask us those questions. So yeah, as you know, we're conducting the research around this assembly process. Some of that is to do with improving the assembly whilst it's in process, and the rest of the research is to do with understanding what's actually happened during the assembly, how members' understanding of climate change has changed, what impacts it has on policy, and all these kind of questions. So some of you have signed up for the research, most of you have, which is fantastic. There's a few of you who haven't, and it is voluntary, but we would really encourage you to join, particularly younger people. Anybody under 20, we'd really like to get your views. But what I'd quite like to do now is just give you the opportunity to ask us any questions if you have any. That's something that you can do now before we finish in a couple of minutes.
Well, what we're going to do is to sort of do the finishing up of the rest of the business, and then anyone who wants to stay and ask any questions about the research, or is considering maybe, that they haven't signed up yet, but actually would just like to know a bit more about it and might consider signing up to be part of the surveys, can stay on the line and actually speak to some of the team. And then the people who do want to get away, or actually are already involved and don't have any questions, can get away. So I'm just going to hand over to Ian, really. Oh, actually, I'm going to do a few practical things and then hand over to Ian to kind of wind us up for the day. So actually, Kelly's going to do some practical things.
Sure am. So yes, it's just a few reminders before I hand over to Ian to bring us to a close today. But as Kayla said and Nadine said, please do stay on to speak to the research team if you'd find that helpful. So on Sunday, tomorrow, we will be going back to the emerging recommendations for homes, travel, diet and land use aspects of our work in Stream. So you're really encouraged to review the summary sheets and the draft proposed goals and recommendations in preparation for the morning session. And we will also have another carousel session, this time to focus on the other set of questions. Just a reminder as well about the vote. So a short while after the close of today, you will receive an email and you are asked to vote on the Assembly business. So you have until 2 p.m. tomorrow to complete that vote. So you do have an option, especially if you need some support, to check in with us in the morning, and you will have until 2 p.m., which is the end of the lunch break tomorrow, to complete that vote. So that link will be coming to you via email, and the support team are there if you have any questions at all. So of course, I've said it a few times over the course of the day and within my stream, but it's really, really important that everyone is involved in these decisions. So if you do have any access difficulties with that form, get in touch with the support team, but we really do hope that you all participate in that vote. We will be starting again tomorrow in our streams at 10 a.m. So please do make sure you're here on time and get in touch if you need us for anything at all. So that's it for all the formal reminders. Again, if you want to stay on to speak to the research team, Ian will just bring us to a close now, and then you'll have a chance to talk to them. Ian, over to you.
I like how you guys get to do all the practical things and I get to do the impractical ending. But thanks for that. It's been a great day. I mean, and that was it's been a hard day. I'm sure there's been a lot of tough conversations, and that final talk by Chris really, I think, nicely reminded us of the complexity, the sprawling interconnectedness, and the sheer challenge of what we're dealing with. But I think also gave us glimmers that there are ways through. There are ways to get to that future, but that it's all going to be about choices and about decisions. And that's really what we're wrestling with. So thanks for today, and look forward to picking up some of these issues tomorrow. So take care.